Just a warning before we begin, the following segment contains content that some viewers may find distressing. Viewer discretion is advised. G'day everyone, welcome back to Frontlines and Faultlines. Good to have you back again, and we're going to continue our survey of the laws of armed conflicts issues. We're basically starting out by understanding what those are about and what targeting processes look like in reality, and then we're going to apply that construct to the situation that we have seen unfold in Gaza over the last year. And so just to finish off on those comments relating to those targeting processes that we've evolved through recent conflicts and the technical tools we have to help us to be more accurate with our targeting. Now, I mentioned that some countries are not signed up to the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions. For example, the United States. It's obviously an issue for countries like Australia and the UK as part of the Five Eyes world and in coalition operation settings. So we have a system in place that deals with that, and it's kind of in shorthand called the red card system. So if there's a national position that you might have on an issue that emerges from additional protocol 1 or an approach to targeting, then what would happen in those settings is that that nation would flag to a coalition partner that we were not able to engage in that targeting effort or would do it differently. And so then what we found, for example, in Iraq in 2003, was that generally that would mean that your coalition partners would all then agree that as a joint position that we wouldn't adopt that targeting approach, or that target would not be targeted. So we have systems in place how we manage these in coalition contexts, and it works very well. So let's now move to a deep dive on some of the specific legal provisions that now relate to that targeting regime that I've talked about. So when we go to additional Protocol 1 again, in Article 48 of Protocol 1, it talks about the planning and executing of military operations and really sets out this issue of the need to discriminate between and distinguish between civilian populations and combatants, and between civilian objects and military objects. So that sets the basic standard that has to be applied. Of course, there's obviously a lot to unpack in relation to that general statement. So when we're talking about civilians and civilian objects, basically the legal definition of that is it's any person, obviously, who's not a soldier. And if there's any doubt, then you have to treat the person as a civilian until you can establish otherwise. Unless, of course, that person is immediately posing a direct threat to you, and in which case you can defend yourself in any circumstance. Civilians don't have the right to participate in combat. It's something that's not well understood. And so, if they do violate that protection status that they have, or compromise other protections, then if they do that intentionally and deliberately, then they themselves may be guilty of a war crime, and certainly they're not entitled to prisoner of war status, for example. And this is obviously something we come back to with how Hamas and ISIS and these terrorist movements conduct their operations. So civilian objects are objects that don't contribute at all to the military effort and therefore can't be military objectives. And there is an obligation on defenders, the states or others who are organised armed forces in a type of conflict that might not be in a state-on-state conflict, that they have to make an effort to clearly distinguish objects that are protected if it's not obvious. So what we normally see with hospitals is they'll have Red Cross symbols on them, and there is a symbol that you can use to identify historic buildings that have special protection, or civil defence buildings, etc. So that's the regime that can apply to how you can actually visibly distinguish some of these protected objects. So when we talk about lawful targets and military objectives, these are the things which, by their nature or by their location or their purpose or use, make an effective contribution to military action. So that could be if someone is using a steeple in a church to vector targeting from artillery or airstrikes, etc., then it loses its protection, and it's obviously something that's now making a contribution to the military effort of the defenders or your opponents. So things will automatically become a military objective once they become a part of the military effort or military capability that you're confronting. So lawful targets, well established, well accepted criteria for that. Obviously military assets, the obvious things like tanks, aircraft, ships, etc. But also airfields, and includes dual use airfields. Fuel depots, obviously fuel is a critical component of military capability and effort, particularly if it's to be sustained over a period of time. Railways for the movement of logistics and supplies, etc. Electricity, highways, bridges, command posts, obviously the military command posts, but communications facilities of any kind that might relate to the military capability, and generally industry, particularly in long-term conflicts where industry has been converted or making a really significant contribution to the military effort, or any kind of a contribution, in fact. So this then also relates to the designation of, or the description of, a category of testing the advantage or the military objective as well, where there's obviously some issue related to the potential civilian casualties and whatnot. And we talk about the test of military necessity or military advantage. So what is the benefit of destroying this target, specifically from a military point of view, considered as a whole? So a belligerent can use only that amount of force that's necessary to achieve a military objective. So that amount of force and no more. And that use of force can't be prohibited in any other way by the laws of armed conflict. So, for example, chemical weapons are no longer permitted in warfare. Things like biological weapons and dum-dum bullets and these sorts of things. And it's those who've signed up to the Anti-Personnel Landmines Convention. So there are specific types of applications of force or technologies or weaponry that is prohibited under the laws of armed conflict. So that relates to that specific category. And really there's a general principle that you have to try and adopt an approach to operations that will result in the least cause of civilian casualties that you possibly can. But I come back to this point again, that it is a brutal calculus in the laws of armed conflict. It does not require the elimination of all civilian casualties, and in every single war there have been civilian casualties. They don't necessarily constitute a war crime if that happens, and we'll come back and tease that out now. So when they talk about an indiscriminate attack, which is spelled out for the first time really in Protocol 1 to this extent, that when we talked about the approach in World War II to carpet bombing an area where you had very significant military facilities or factories making an important contribution to the war, but it might be in a city or an urban area, the only way to accurately guarantee you were going to hit that target is by throwing a lot of dumb ordnance in an area in which that factory is, and knowing that a lot of that ordnance is going to be scattered more broadly and cause more civilian casualties. So it's not permissible to treat as a single military objective a number of really collected, widespread military objectives. And so you will have large areas of civilian populations and facilities, perhaps within that broad circle you might draw. So these days the obligation is there to really try and specifically confine your targeting to the direct military objective as much as possible. But you also are in a situation where if you really need to and you've got to guarantee that facility is destroyed, then the equation becomes how much of a contribution to the military effort is that facility making when you're evaluating the potential casualties that could be caused. And so then you come to that second point of this has got to be where the expected civilian loss of life isn't going to be excessive to that really concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. And in relation to that test of concrete and direct military advantage, there's quite a broad scope of analysis and situation and context that applies to that. So we'll talk about that, particularly in relation to the Gaza war. Now, I mentioned that there are national declarations and military manual interpretations of a lot of these things, and they're very important for coming to a legal definition of what is permitted and what isn't. And so Australia, for example, in relation to this issue of military advantage, says that that's intended to mean the advantage considered as a whole in the context of that conflict, in perhaps the greater strategic sense, the greater evaluation of the threats and circumstances that you might face, the need perhaps to resolve an incident in one location as quickly as possible because you'll have threats in other locations, etc. So that's a reference to really being able to sit back and put it in the context of the broader strategic situation. So we've added to those comments that not only is this isolated from particular parts of that attack, but that term means a variety of considerations that include security of your own forces, etc. So there's a broad array of factors that will be applied to assessing the necessity of that attack. And then, this is a really important part of this conversation, is this point about proportionality. And there is a really seriously bad level of understanding of what proportionality means in the laws of armed conflict. Proportionality doesn't mean you can only cause the same amount of casualties that have been caused to you, or that if you've had a particular number of civilian casualties caused by an enemy to you, that you can then go out and cause that amount of civilian casualties to the enemy. It's absolutely not what this principle is all about. And it's defined in Protocol 1 more precisely than previously. So it means that you have to verify that civilians or civilian objects are not the sole object of the attack, for a start. And then there's the introduction of an array of precautions that an attacker might need to take in determining the method of attack or needing to limit civilian casualties. And previously we talked about all the technical and other systemic measures that have been taken by, Western forces in particular in recent armed conflicts to sort of deliver on that requirement to be very cautious and take all the measures that you have to take to make sure that civilian casualties will be limited. And so the question of proportionality then comes back to this contribution to the military purpose. An attack or an operation is considered as a whole to be able to achieve, to succeed in doing, as compared with other consequences, such as the effect on civilians. So you weigh this in a scale, a balancing scale of what that contribution to your operation, your success is going to be. And then it has to be acceptable, that relationship between the legitimate destructive effect and the undesirable collateral effects. So it's also really important to emphasize that that test is based on the reasonableness of the decision and not based on some 20/20 hindsight type situation. So if a decision is made and it turns out that some of the factors that have been used to make that decision, information was incorrect or simple mistakes were made in the attack, then that is not a war crime. A war crime is based on the intentionality of what's done. Did you have the specific intention of going out there and definitely creating civilian casualties as your priority? So that's the actual test in relation to it being a war crime. And so when we look at that, that's got to be based on all the information available at the time to a commander. So what we do know under the law is there are specific categories defined in the category of non-combatants who under no circumstances should be deliberately targeted. We've talked about civilians, but also that includes medical and religious personnel. And there's extra caution that's required when you know that there's medical or religious facilities, assets or personnel in the location. Journalists, wounded, sick and shipwrecked. There's a whole convention dedicated to wounded, sick and shipwrecked. Prisoners of war, a whole convention dedicated to the regime around management and protection of prisoners of war. And then also we've seen more additional requirements in recent times in relation to civil defence facilities, the first responders, etc., who also require special protection. So when we're talking about these protected persons and facilities, obviously the facilities that these persons use will have special protections. They've added dams, dikes, and nuclear facilities in the protocols now because of the wider destructive consequences of attacking those sites. It doesn't mean that they might, in all circumstances, be, not able to be attacked. For example, if you've seen military facilities all over a dam that have been located there, particularly maybe to avoid targeting, you would still be able to target those facilities, perhaps on that dam site. Power stations, of course, is an issue of evaluation when they're nuclear. It's really a question of the wider area, long-term consequences to the environment and to the civilian population if those nuclear power stations have been targeted and destroyed. And it introduces in Protocol 1 for the first time considerations about the environment, not just that question of whether the nuclear impact is going to have long-term consequences, but other types of attacks, like if you destroyed, for example, a tailings dam from a uranium mine that would then flood a wide area and cause very long-term and serious impacts on the environment. So those are the basic rules, but again, this loss of protection happens if they have been used by your enemy to make a serious military contribution. But again, even if an object loses its special protection, the principle of proportionality still applies to the attack that you might conduct against it. So if, for example, you had one sniper firing from a window in a hospital, you would probably be best advised to target that single sniper rather than try and destroy the entire hospital, for example. So when we talk about the issue of targeting these days, there's been a lot of discussion and debate about the introduction of artificial intelligence and automation and where we're going with all of that. There's been a lot of discussion about whether or not that actually challenges the laws. In reality, it doesn't, in the sense that the whole issue of AI and artificial intelligence will still mean that there's going to be someone held accountable for directing assets, using assets to fight a campaign. And if no precautions have been violated, if civilian casualties have been deliberately caused by an attack, then that'll still be a war crime, and the person who's responsible for creating that attack will still be liable criminally for any war crime. But the principle that the ICRC has articulated in relation to the development of AI and automated systems is that they still want to see the human element front and center in targeting decisions that are made. They'd prefer that there was someone who was determining whether an attack should happen or not, rather than that decision itself being automated. So they also have tried to encourage people that ethical factors should be considered as well, and making sure that the human process is not outsourced to machines and software. It is actually a very important point that AI is a very strong contributor to refining that targeting process, to accelerating all the factors that need to go into that to try and avoid civilian casualties. It's a very important tool to process a lot of information quickly and effectively, and perhaps eliminate a lot of human error in that process. So AI and automation can be a very important tool to improving the minimisation of civilian casualties actually in armed conflict. And a lot of that has been occurring in the way Western militaries have been evolving the introduction of these technologies into their systems. The war in Ukraine, for example, has seen a lot of that happening. So these applications are to be encouraged, not discouraged, but The way the ADF approaches this and other Western militaries is that there will always be a human making the final decision on targeting, the selection of a target, approval of a target, etc. And again, where civilian casualties are factored into that, there will be levels of responsibility assigned to making a decision when those levels of civilian casualties pass through higher brackets of expected results. So all of those things will still be in place. So that then brings us to the Hamas situation and what we've seen play out over the course of the year. And it's important that we do this simply as a matter of applying the law and not allowing, as I say, hot politics to make bad law and trying to shoehorn a situation into laws that don't exist or bend and break the laws in a way that harms their respect and application. And there's been no conflict I know of that has been a demonstration of hotter politics than the war in Gaza. And so let's unpack some of those issues now. The first thing to understand is the strategic threat that has been posed by Hamas and the broader context of that in relation to Israel's defense and security. And it's important to point out, I think, too, that throughout its entire history, Israel has never actually started a war. Any war that it's been involved in has always been in self-defense. And this war is a classic example of that. So when you look at the history of the threat just from Hamas to Israel, in that 17, 18-year period, if you include the war, you've seen 52,000 missiles and rockets launched against Israel over that period of time. I don't know of any capable nation that would put up with that over that length of time. And certainly Israel has tried to discourage that and respond to it and eliminate the threat through targeted strikes into Gaza rather than, full-scale invasion that we're seeing now over those years. But of course, that has not resolved the situation as we've seen recently in this war. But over that time too, you'll see the targeting radius here from the capabilities that Hamas has with its weaponry. And over time, those capabilities pretty much now extend to almost the entire inhabited area of Israel. So that threat now is a complete nationwide threat for Israel and can, be directed at times just simply to do large-scale economic damage or depopulation of areas of Israel as part of the objective. So this is quite a broader strategic threat that's evolved over time, aided and abetted by Iran in getting more sophisticated weaponry and capabilities and ranges into the arsenal of Hamas. So that's important to understand from the point of view of that strategic threat. Then when we look at what actually happened on the 7th of October 2023, is you had effectively a brigade-sized invasion, and it was actually a brigade. It was the Nukba brigade of Hamas, so about 3,800 members of that brigade. And then there were a follow-on group of probably about 2,200 civilians who came in behind the Nukba brigade and simply participated in looting and murder of Israeli civilians, joined in that activity, that process. It's interesting too when you look at this. I've seen people comment that Israel doesn't have a strategic depth problem, that they found ways to get around that problem, which is one of the most ridiculous comments I've ever seen from a military point of view. Strategic depth is a geospatial concept. If you look at Australia, we have a massive advantage of strategic depth, protected by our sea and air gap as well, the distance that we have from potential threats and enemies. It's obvious to us, that you've got an advantage there and you find ways to actually exploit and enhance that advantage for sure, but it's a geospatial advantage. Israel is a tiny country, as we saw through the history section of this presentation. There is no room for error. At its thinnest point from the edge of the West Bank to Netanya, for example, it's only about 9 miles. So they have no room for error in that situation. And October the 7th really highlights and demonstrates that strategic depth problem, because what you had was breaching of a barrier, which then resulted in a matter of minutes, a large number of terrorists and those who would do harm to Israelis being able to have access to a large number of settlements and facilities in a matter of minutes, just by getting through the fence and the barrier between Israel and the Gaza Strip. If anything demonstrates that lack of strategic depth, it would have been this assault, and it should put that issue to bed for once and for all. So for anybody to say that Israel doesn't have a strategic depth problem, they don't know what they're talking about. And this incident highlights that fact. So once they got across the border, of course, what happened was they encountered the Nova Music Festival. We had hundreds of young people just there to try and promote peace and love, and to enjoy music and dance, etc. And there was also very close to that border area a lot of settlements, kibbutzim, which are the socialist type settlements that exist along the borders there, communal setups. And these people who lived in the kibbutzim were the people who were most prominent in promoting the peace process, and many of them involved in voluntary systems of ferrying Gaza's citizens to more higher-end medical support in Israel and returning them again. So the shame and the irony of them being the primary target of this assault was there for all to see. And, of course, there were a lot of more military border posts, etc., too, along the edges of that border, which were the primary focus in the initial assault as it proceeded. But it also was fully a component of the attacks, the intent of the attacks, to conduct the widest possible mass slaughter as possible of the civilian population, and that included the elderly, disabled, and children. And later on, we'll look at that in a bit more detail and see, what the reality of that day was, because there's been a lot of misinformation and denial about what happened on that day. We've even had some claims that, the IDF and the Israelis conducted that slaughter themselves, etc. Some incredible conspiracy theories around this, and we'll unpack that later on. So this is what that day looked like, and the breadth and depth of the scale of the assault, and how far they penetrated into southern Israel. So you can see this also really brings home that point that there is no strategic depth for Israel. One mistake, one error, one intelligence failure can have this kind of consequence, notwithstanding the military capabilities that Israel has. So their need to be on their game constantly, every day, every hour, every minute, is brought home by this attack. And of course, there'd been a lot of preparation for this attack over a long period of time, and there'd been a lot of Iranian assistance in it, and it wasn't an isolated part of the plan. It was a lot broader context to this plan, which we'll cover. So coming back to what happened on the day, though, one of the most horrendous things and dimensions of this attack was the wide-scale rape and sexual violence that accompanied it. And it was really shocking to see a failure of women's organisations at the UN, etc., to really call this out from day one. But the Secretary-General's Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict, Pramila Patten, at least was bold enough to do that. And Pramila actually went and saw the 5,000 photographic images and the 50 hours of footage of the attacks. And a lot of that footage came from Hamas itself. They had GoPro cams on themselves, and in the vicinity, and iPhones, etc. A lot of the horrendous things that were done on that day, they filmed themselves proudly, boasting of the scale of the slaughter of civilians that was happening. And her comments on seeing all that material was that what I witnessed in Israel was scenes of unspeakable violence perpetrated with shocking brutality. It was a catalogue of the most extreme and inhumane forms of killing, torture, and other horrors, including sexual violence. And that included some of the most gratuitous and sadistic acts that I've ever read or heard of. I spent a year in Iraq, and we dealt with, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, who were engaged in torture and beheadings and the like, and someone that I dealt with was beheaded there. And, it was pretty shocking, but nothing like what happened by the Hamas attack on October the 7th. A new level of savagery that, we have to unpack why people were able to do that. And I talked before about the indoctrination that happens through the education system in Gaza that Hamas operates through UNRWA and with the funding from other agencies and Western countries that provide that funding, that gives Hamas the ability to create people and fighters who will be prepared to conduct these types of assaults and commit these types of horrendous acts. So look, we'll call it quits there for this week, and we'll come back and start to do a deeper dive down on that broader strategic concept and try and understand better what the nature of this conflict was all about. So thanks for being with me. Pretty heavy content, I know, but we have to understand what we're dealing with here if we're to really come up with an informed opinion on it all. So thanks very much, and we'll see you next week. Cheers.